September 2022. A Friday night. The sun has already gone down. A car slowly comes to a stop on a dirt road near the Hungarian border. Darkness stretches across the fields. Only the headlights cut through the night. Behind the wheel sits a friend. Neither man says much. In moments like this, words rarely help. Mark grabs a small backpack, opens the door, steps outside. For a few seconds, he just stands there. Then he shakes his friend's hand and takes his first step into the darkness. Ahead of him are fields, trees, brush, and a border that separates Ukraine from Hungary. In his pocket is a phone. Inside that phone are a few photographs: his wife, his son, his family. Before moving forward, Mark takes the phone out one more time. He opens a picture of his son, looks at it for a few seconds, locks the screen, puts the phone away, and starts walking. He doesn't know what will happen in an hour. He doesn't know what tomorrow will bring. He doesn't even know if he's making the right decision. But he knows one thing: he wants to see his family. And for that, he's willing to risk everything. There were two escapes in Mark's life. The first one lasted for years. The second one began on this very night. A few years earlier, Mark's life looked very different. He had a wife, a young son, a job, friends, and a problem he rarely talked about: alcohol. At first, it seemed harmless. Then it became a habit. Then it became part of everyday life. Alcohol rarely destroys a person all at once. It does it slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. First it takes your evenings, then your mornings, then your plans, then your dreams. Mark still loved his family, he loved his wife, he loved his son. He worked hard, helped people whenever he could, but more and more often he felt like life was passing him by. Every night he told himself the same thing: tomorrow I'll change, tomorrow I'll stop drinking, tomorrow I'll start over. But tomorrow never seemed to arrive. Sometimes he would wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and barely recognize the man staring back at him. The hardest part wasn't the hangover, it was the shame. The promises he couldn't keep, the time he couldn't get back, the life slowly slipping through his fingers. Years later, there was one night he still remembered clearly. His son was only a few months old. Mark woke up to the sound of a door opening. His wife stood in the doorway, exhausted, holding their baby. The child had been crying for a long time. Mark had fallen into such a deep alcohol-fueled sleep that he hadn't heard any of it. Not the crying, not his wife, not the struggle happening just a few feet away. She handed him the baby, then quietly said, "I can't do this anymore. Please make him a bottle." Mark took his son into his arms, tiny, helpless, and slowly walked into the kitchen. He filled a bottle, prepared the formula, and listened as the baby continued to cry. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, not as a husband, not as a worker, not as a friend, but as a father. And he asked himself one simple question: is this really the father I want my son to remember? The answer was obvious, but it would still take a long time before his life truly changed. For all those years, one person never completely gave up on him: his wife. She had seen the best parts of Mark, and she had seen the worst. She could have walked away, she could have stopped believing, she could have decided that enough was enough. But she didn't. She waited, she endured, she hoped, because somewhere beneath the mistakes and the alcohol, she still saw the man she had fallen in love with. She believed he was still there, lost perhaps, but not gone. Then the war began. Almost overnight, everything changed. Families were forced to make decisions they never imagined having to make. Mark's wife and son left for the Czech Republic. Mark stayed behind in Ukraine. And suddenly, something stood between them that had never been there before. Distance. The days moved slowly. The apartment felt empty. Too quiet. There were phone calls, video chats, photographs, one day after another, 1 week after another. At first, Mark counted the days. Then he stopped. There were simply too many of them. New pictures of his son kept arriving on his phone. In one photo, he was smiling. In another, he was playing on a playground, then holding a new toy, then speaking more clearly, then looking taller, older, growing up. Mark would stare at those photos for long stretches of time, and every time he felt the same thing. His son was becoming more and more of a little person, and Mark wasn't there to see it. He wasn't just missing days, he was missing his son's childhood. That hurt more than anything else. The evenings were the hardest. The apartment would grow quiet. Sometimes Mark would sit alone with his phone, scrolling through old pictures, listening to old videos, hearing his son's voice, watching moments that had already passed. And little by little, he began to realize something frightening. He wasn't only losing time, he was losing his life. One evening, he called a friend. When the friend answered, Mark said only a few words. "I can't keep living like this." The friend didn't lecture him, didn't judge him, didn't tell him how he should live. He simply listened, and then he helped. With that support, Mark finally took the first real step towards sobriety. For some people, it might not have seemed like much. For Mark, it was one of the most important victories of his life. That evening, he sat alone by the window. Outside, the city was dark, just as dark as he had often felt inside. He opened a photo of his wife, then one of his son. And for the first time in years, he felt something he thought he had lost. Hope. Small, quiet, fragile, but real. A little later, he called his wife. She answered almost immediately. They talked for a long time about ordinary things, about their son, about school, about daily life, about the future. And for the first time in a very long time, Mark said something out loud that he had barely dared to admit to himself. He wanted to change. He didn't want to lose his life anymore. He wanted his family back. He wanted to become the man his wife once believed he could be. After the call ended, he sat in silence, looking out into the darkness. And maybe that's where his new life truly began. Not at the border, not in the Czech Republic, not at the train station, but there, alone in a quiet room, when he finally stopped running from himself. But his family was still far away, in another country. Every day he thought about his wife, his son, how quickly children grow, how many moments he had already missed, and how many more he might lose. A battle was taking place inside him. He thought about the war, about responsibility, about uncertainty. And at the same time, he thought about his family, about the possibility of never seeing them again. Mark didn't see himself as a hero, and he wasn't looking for excuses. He was simply a man standing in front of an impossible choice. Until one day, he realized something. He couldn't stay where he was forever. Sooner or later, he would have to take the next step, even if that step changed the rest of his life. One September evening, Mark met up with the same friend who had helped him begin rebuilding his life. They drove in silence for most of the trip. Outside the window, daylight slowly faded away. The road became emptier, the houses became fewer, the lights became more distant, and the darkness grew deeper. Eventually, the car turned onto a narrow dirt road. Then it stopped. Years later, Mark would still remember that moment. The engine shut off. Neither man said much. They didn't need to. Some things are understood without words. Mark picked up his backpack, opened the door, stepped outside. A few moments later, the red taillights disappeared into the darkness, and he was alone. The night was cool, the fields were silent. Only the wind moved through the tall grass. Ahead of him was a path he had never walked before. Ahead of him was uncertainty. Behind him was a life he no longer wanted to lose. He walked carefully, listening to every sound, every movement, every rustle in the darkness. At times, the grass reached almost to his waist. His legs grew tired, but he kept moving forward. Time seemed to disappear. There was only the night, the field, and his thoughts. Thoughts of his wife, thoughts of his son, thoughts of the life waiting somewhere beyond the darkness. Eventually the forest began. Branches caught on his clothes, dry sticks cracked beneath his feet. Sometimes he stopped completely, listening, waiting, then moving forward again. It's easy to lose your way in the dark, especially when you don't know the road. But this time, Mark knew exactly where he wanted to end up. Years earlier, he had walked home carrying a bottle. Now he walked through the night, carrying photographs of his family. Years earlier, he had been running away from himself. Now he was walking back toward himself. For the first time, he understood the difference between the two escapes that had shaped his life. The first one had taken things away from him. The second one was giving them back. After some time, he saw it. A fence, a dark silhouette cutting through the night. A border between two countries, and in many ways, a border between two lives. On the other side was uncertainty, but it was also where hope lived. Mark kept moving, one step at a time, not thinking about tomorrow, only thinking about the people he loved. Hours later, distant lights appeared in the darkness. First a farm, then a few houses, then a small Hungarian village, the first streetlights, the first quiet roads, the first feeling that maybe the hardest part was over. For the first time in a long while, he felt relief, real relief, the kind that lets you finally take a full breath. A short time later, Mark approached the police on his own. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't running, he wasn't inventing stories. He simply told them the truth, that he had come from Ukraine, that he was trying to reach his family, that he wanted a chance to start over. Standing before them wasn't a criminal. And it wasn't a hero, just a tired man, a man who had walked a long road and wanted to see the people he loved. Mark would never forget that moment, because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel fear, he felt hope. Hope that he would soon hold his son again. Not long afterward, a friend arrived from Austria, another person who refused to leave him alone when life became difficult. When they saw each other, they shook hands firmly, no speeches, no dramatic words, just understanding. Both men knew what this moment meant. Ahead of them was the road to the Czech Republic, to his wife, to his son, to a new life. They drove across highways, past gas stations, past cities glowing in the distance. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat quietly. At one point, the friend looked over and asked, "So, are you nervous?" Mark smiled. For the first time in months, the answer was no. The fear was behind him now. All that remained was anticipation. The anticipation of seeing his family again. That night taught him something he would never forget. The hardest roads in life are rarely traveled alone. Almost always, someone appears along the way. Someone who helps carry you through the darkness. Outside the window, countries came and went. Roads came and went. The landscape kept changing, but one thought stayed the same. Every mile brought him closer to his family. Every mile brought him closer to his son. Every mile brought him closer to the life he had almost lost. And for the first time in many years, he wasn't running away from something. He was moving towards something that truly mattered. By the time they crossed into the Czech Republic, the sun was beginning to rise. The sky was slowly growing brighter. After a long night, the first colors of a new day appeared on the horizon. Mark barely slept. In truth, he probably couldn't have slept even if he wanted to. For months, he had imagined this moment, a moment that once seemed impossible. A little later, he was standing at a train station. People moved in every direction. Some were rushing to catch a train. Some were heading home. Some were saying goodbye. Others were welcoming loved ones. For most people, it was an ordinary day, but not for Mark. He kept looking in one direction, waiting, watching, hoping. His heart was pounding just as hard as it had near the border. Only this time, it was a different kind of fear. The fear that none of this was real. The fear that he might wake up and find himself alone again. Back in an empty apartment, hundreds of miles away from the people he loved. Then he saw a familiar figure, his wife, and beside her, a small boy, his son. For a moment, Mark froze. It felt as though time itself had stopped. The noise of the station faded away. The announcements, the footsteps, the conversations, all of it disappeared. There was only one thing left in the world. His family. His son noticed him too. The little boy stopped walking. For a second, he simply stared, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then he ran, as fast as he could, straight across the station. Mark barely remembers moving. He only remembers the feeling of two small arms wrapping around his neck. He remembers his son's voice. He remembers tears he no longer had any reason to hide. Months of separation, months of phone calls, months of photographs on a screen, and suddenly all of it was over. His son was there, real, warm, alive, not on a phone screen, not in a photograph, not in a video call, but right there in his arms. And in that moment, Mark knew the journey had been worth it. Every step, every mile, every sleepless night. A few seconds later, his wife was standing beside him, the same woman who had never completely stopped believing in him, the same woman who had waited for him to find his way back. They embraced for a long time, without saying much, because sometimes words only get in the way. Sometimes the most important things have already been said without speaking. Around them, life continued. Trains arrived. Announcements echoed through the station. People hurried from place to place. But for Mark, the world stood still. After months apart, his family was finally together again. And in that moment, a foreign country no longer felt foreign, because the people he loved most were standing beside him. They remained there for a few moments, holding on to each other, almost afraid to let go. Then Mark looked at his wife, smiled, and quietly asked, "So, did you actually believe I'd make it?" She wiped away a tear, looked at him, and smiled. Honestly, I was starting to get annoyed that you were taking so long. For a few seconds, all three of them laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes after months of fear, months of uncertainty, months of waiting, and for the first time in a very long while, everything felt normal. In that moment, Mark realized how much he had missed the sound of his family's laughter. The ordinary conversations, the small moments, the things people often take for granted. Because in the end, that's what happiness usually looks like. Not something grand, not something dramatic, just the people you love, together. Life in the Czech Republic wasn't easy. Everything had to start from the beginning. A new country, a new language, new rules, a new life. The first months were difficult. There was a lot to learn, a lot to understand. But Mark knew how to work with his hands. And that skill helped him even when words failed him. He found work installing hot tubs and spa equipment, traveling between towns, solving technical problems, building things, fixing things, learning as he went. Before long, people began to notice. They realized he had a gift, not just for repairing machines, but for bringing things back to life. Soon people started calling him outside of work. Someone needed help fixing a bicycle. Someone else needed a scooter repaired, a motorcycle, an engine, a machine everyone else had already given up on. Mark enjoyed that kind of work. He liked restoring things, giving broken things another chance. Sometimes he thought that's exactly what he had been doing with his own life. Slowly, patiently, one day at a time, rebuilding something he had almost lost forever. There was one person who had always held a special place in Mark's life, his mother. Many years earlier, her marriage had fallen apart. Later, she discovered that Mark's father had been living a second life abroad for years. For her, it was a devastating betrayal. One of those wounds that never completely disappear. The kind that changes the way a person looks at the world. Mark remembered that pain. He remembered the years that followed, and because of that, he always tried to stay close, to help, to support her, to make sure she never felt alone. The years passed. Slowly, life began to settle, piece by piece. And one summer, Mark did something he once thought would be impossible. He took his family to Italy, his wife, his son, and his mother. For most people, it would have been just another vacation. For his mother, it was something much bigger. She was 60 years old, and for the first time in her life, she saw the sea. For the first time in her life, she saw Italy. For the first time in her life, she sat on a warm beach and looked out at the endless water. After everything she had endured, after years of disappointment, after years of loneliness, she simply sat there and watched the waves, and nearby her grandson ran across the sand, laughing, playing, living the kind of childhood every grandparent hopes to witness. That day, Mark watched his mother, and he thought about how strange life can be. Years earlier, she had cried because of a man who chose another life far away from home. Now she sat beside the sea, with a son who had stayed, a son who had fought his way back. And somehow there was something deeply fair about that, something deeply human, something no amount of money could ever buy. His wife was there, his son was there, his mother was there. And for a moment, Mark thought about how close he had once come to losing all of it. Not the trips, not the work, not the plans, the people who gave meaning to everything else. Time moved forward. Another child was born into the family. Life continued with all its challenges, all its responsibilities, all the ordinary struggles that come with building a future. But now it had meaning. Now it had direction. Now it had hope. Today, Mark comes home after work. He opens the front door. Children's voices fill the house. His wife is in the kitchen preparing dinner. Somewhere nearby, the kids are laughing. A bicycle waits against the wall, something he's been fixing in his spare time. An ordinary evening, an ordinary life. The same life that once felt almost impossible to reach. People often say that hard times change us. Maybe that's true. But Mark's story isn't really about hardship, and it isn't really about war. It's about choices, it's about second chances, and it's about the people who refuse to stop believing in us, even when we've stopped believing in ourselves. There were two escapes in Mark's life. The first one lasted for years. It began almost every evening. Alcohol allowed him to forget his problems for a few hours, but every time it took something away in return. His time, his peace, his future. Back then he was running from himself, from responsibility, from fear, from the life he didn't know how to face. The second escape happened on that dark September night near the Hungarian border, through fields, through forests, through uncertainty, through fear. But this time everything was different. Because for the first time he wasn't running away from something, he was moving towards someone, toward his family, toward a life that could still be saved. And perhaps most importantly, toward himself. At the beginning of this story, Mark was walking through a dark field. There was only the wind, the night, and the unknown. In his pocket was a phone filled with photographs of the people he was afraid to lose. Today, everything is different. His family sits around the table. Warm light fills the kitchen. Children laugh in the next room. His wife is nearby. His children are nearby. And so is the life he once risked everything to get back. That evening, the house was noisy. The kids were laughing, someone was telling a story. Dinner was almost ready. The kitchen was warm, the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. Mark paused for a moment and looked around, at his wife, at his children, at the life they had built together. And he realized something. There was a time when he was terrified of losing exactly this. Not money, not work, not plans, this. Once, his world had been grey, without direction, without hope, without colour. But one day, he found his way back. Back to the people he loved. Back to the life he had almost lost. People often think the greatest victories happen on battlefields, in stadiums, in boardrooms, in history books. But sometimes the greatest victory in life is much smaller than that. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply finding your way home. There were two escapes in Mark's life. The first was away from himself. The second was toward his family. And maybe that's why one day the world finally got its colours back.